Everett Hale vanished from the company for an entire month, leaving behind nothing but whispered mockery that he was just a single father whom the female CEO had taken pity on. The executive board declared he had fled when the crisis hit hardest. The chief financial officer was already preparing to seize his position and erase every trace of his influence. But on that particular morning, when Everett walked back through the front entrance carrying a worn suitcase and wearing exhaustion across his face, the entire grand lobby fell into stunned silence. Genevieve Whitmore-Kingsley, the coldest CEO on Wall Street, abandoned a billion-dollar meeting mid-sentence, rushed downstairs, and wrapped her arms around him in front of everyone. If you enjoy dramatic, satisfying twists full of emotion and justice, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story. The headquarters of Kingsley Whitmore Global occupied a gleaming tower on the southern edge of Manhattan, its glass facade reflecting the harbor in long vertical strips that made the building look like a monument to old money and modern ambition. Inside those walls, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically over the past 30 days, because the man who once sat closest to the CEO's inner circle had not been seen, heard from, or mentioned in any official capacity since the first week of the previous month. Everett Hale's desk on the 42nd floor remained untouched, his security badge still active but unused, and the only explanation anyone had received was a vague internal memo stating he had been reassigned to a confidential international engagement at the CEO's personal discretion. That explanation satisfied almost no one, particularly because Everett did not look like the kind of man a global conglomerate would send overseas for anything critical, and the rumors that filled the vacuum of his absence grew uglier with each passing day. He had no family fortune, no Ivy League pedigree displayed in gold frames, no tailored suits from European fashion houses, and his entire presence in the company had always seemed, to those who judged worth by appearance, like a charitable gesture rather than a strategic decision. The whispers moved through conference rooms and elevator banks with the efficiency of a virus. The single dad from the suburbs had finally been exposed as a fraud, and the CEO was too embarrassed to admit she had wasted corporate resources on sentiment. Barrett Ashford III fed those whispers with surgical precision, never saying anything directly accusatory in meetings where minutes were recorded, but always finding the right corridor, the right lunch table, the right after-hours gathering to plant another seed of doubt. He told junior analysts that Everett had stopped sending progress reports within the first week abroad, which Barrett claimed proved there was no progress to report. He told the senior vice presidents that a man who could not afford a decent winter coat had no business representing a company worth tens of billions in European financial circles, and that the embarrassment of his presence in Paris would cost them more than whatever deal Genevieve imagined he could secure. Barrett's voice carried the particular confidence of a man born into a family whose name appeared on hospital wings and university libraries, and when he spoke about Everett's inadequacy, people listened not because the evidence was compelling, but because Barrett's social gravity made doubt feel like common sense. He even circulated a joke among the trading floor staff that Everett was probably using the company travel budget to take his daughter sightseeing along the Seine, and the laughter that followed was sharp enough to cut through any remaining goodwill the absent man might have held. Genevieve endured the erosion of Everett's reputation in silence because the agreement being negotiated in France demanded absolute secrecy, and every instinct telling her to defend him publicly had to be suppressed beneath the weight of strategic necessity. She understood that the moment she revealed any detail about the nature of Everett's mission, the information would leak through Barrett's network and reach the competing interests that were already circling Kingsley Whitmore Global like patient predators waiting for the wounded animal to collapse. So she sat through board meetings where Sterling Beaumont, the chairman, whose white hair and patrician bearing gave him the appearance of a man carved from the same marble as the lobby statues, questioned her judgment with increasing sharpness. Sterling did not raise his voice because men of his breeding never needed to, but his questions landed with the force of verdicts. Why had she entrusted an international negotiation to an unknown? Why had she not consulted the board before dispatching someone without credentials? And why, after 30 days, was there no verifiable result to justify the risk she had taken with the company's future? On the final Friday of Everett's absence, Sterling delivered the ultimatum that everyone in the executive suite had been anticipating. He told Genevieve that if Everett did not return with a signed agreement before the restructuring deadline on Monday morning, the board would initiate a vote of no confidence, and her tenure as CEO of the company her own family had built would end not with a resignation, but with a removal. The story of how Everett Hale arrived at Kingsley Whitmore Global in the first place was one that the executive floor preferred to forget, because it contradicted everything they believed about who deserved to occupy space in their world. 1 month before his departure for France, Everett had walked into the building wearing a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, carrying a leather briefcase so worn that the stitching had been repaired twice with thread that did not quite match the original color, and speaking in a voice so calm and low that people in meetings often had to lean forward to hear him. Genevieve had recruited him personally after reading a confidential case study about a mid-sized shipping firm in the Pacific Northwest that had been 72 hours from hostile takeover before an unnamed crisis negotiator restructured their debt architecture, renegotiated 3 vendor contracts simultaneously, and delivered a revised operating model that turned the company profitable within 14 months. She spent 4 weeks tracking down the identity of that negotiator and found Everett living in a modest house outside Philadelphia, raising his daughter alone and consulting for small firms that could not afford the prestigious agencies but needed someone brilliant enough to save them anyway. She offered him a position not as a figurehead, but as her personal strategic advisor, someone who would sit in the room where the real decisions were made and tell her the truth that everyone else was too afraid or too compromised to speak. The executive team despised him from the first morning he appeared on the 42nd floor, and Barrett Ashford III made his contempt the most visible by treating every interaction with Everett as an opportunity to establish dominance through humiliation. During one early meeting about the European debt exposure, Barrett deliberately turned to Everett and asked whether he had ever actually set foot inside an international negotiation chamber, or whether his experience was limited to picking his daughter up from school and then adjusting cells in a financial model from his kitchen table. The question was designed to draw laughter, and it succeeded among the half-dozen executives who understood that aligning with Barrett meant aligning with the Ashford family's considerable influence. Everett did not flinch, did not raise his voice, and did not return the insult with one of his own. Instead, he opened the financial dossier that Barrett's own team had prepared for the meeting, and quietly identified 3 critical vulnerabilities in the company's European exposure that the entire finance division had either missed or deliberately ignored. A cross-collateralization clause that could trigger cascading defaults across 2 subsidiaries, a currency hedge that had been structured to benefit the counterparty rather than Kingsley Whitmore Global, and a missing disclosure in the quarterly filing that bordered on regulatory violation. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of agreement, but the dangerous silence of a room full of powerful people realizing that the man they had dismissed was sharper than all of them combined, and Barrett's hatred for Everett crystallized in that moment into something personal and permanent. Genevieve recognized what she had in Everett, not just intellectually but instinctively, the way a captain in rough seas recognizes the one crew member who does not panic when the hull groans. She called him to her private office on the 61st floor 3 days before his departure, and when the door closed behind him, the transformation in her demeanor was immediate and striking. The woman who commanded boardrooms with a single raised eyebrow and whose public persona had been described by financial journalists as glacial now sat across from Everett, with her hands clasped tightly together and her composure held in place by nothing more than practiced discipline. She told him that Rousseau Atlantique Capital, the French investment fund that represented their last viable path to survival, had withdrawn from preliminary discussions after receiving an internal report suggesting that Kingsley Whitmore Global's leadership was fractured, its financial disclosures were unreliable, and its board was more interested in protecting personal interests than preserving the company. The $2.6 billion refinancing package that would have restructured the European debt, preserved the hotel chain, maintained the shipping ports, and kept the fintech division operational had evaporated in a single phone call, and without it the company would be forced to sell assets at distressed prices to competitors who had been quietly positioning themselves for exactly this outcome. Everett listened without interrupting, which was something Genevieve had noticed about him from the beginning. The way he absorbed information, the way deep water absorbs stones, completely and without disturbance on the surface. When she finished, he told her he would go to Paris and meet Madeleine Rousseau personally, but he needed one thing in return: complete access to every financial document, including the ones the board was hiding, including the ones that would implicate members of her own executive team in negligence or worse. Genevieve agreed without hesitation, because she understood that sending Everett to Paris with anything less than the full truth would be the same as sending him unarmed into a room full of people who made careers out of detecting dishonesty. Before he left her office, she said something that neither of them would forget. She told him that if he failed, she would lose the company. He looked at her with the steady gaze of a man who had learned long ago that promises meant nothing unless you were willing to suffer for them, and he said simply that he would not fail. That evening, before boarding the overnight flight from Kennedy Airport, Everett called his daughter and told her he would be away for a few weeks because of work, but that he would come home. And the brevity of that call contained more truth about who he was than any resume or reference letter ever could, because it revealed a man who fought not for glory or recognition but for the quiet stability that his child deserved and that he refused to let anyone take away. While Everett navigated the complexities of French financial diplomacy 3,000 miles away, Barrett Ashford III conducted his own campaign with the ruthless efficiency of a man who understood that corporate power was not seized in dramatic confrontations but accumulated through the slow poisoning of trust. He began each week by noting in executive briefings that no formal communication had been received from Everett, framing the silence not as evidence of confidentiality but as confirmation of incompetence. He suggested to Sterling Beaumont over private dinners at the Chairman's Club that Genevieve had developed an emotional attachment to Everett that was clouding her professional judgment, and that the company could not afford to be led by a CEO who made personnel decisions based on sympathy rather than strategy. He commissioned a detailed proposal for an alternative restructuring plan that would be executed by a consulting group personally recommended by the Ashford family, a group whose connections to the very competitors seeking to acquire Kingsley Whitmore Global's distressed assets were carefully concealed behind layers of corporate intermediaries. Sterling listened to Barrett's arguments with the measured attention of a man who had survived 5 decades in finance by never committing to a position until the outcome was already determined. And while he did not explicitly endorse Barrett's plan, he did not reject it either, which, in the language of boardroom power, was its own form of permission. Genevieve found herself increasingly isolated as the weeks passed, occupying the peculiar loneliness of a leader who carries certainty like a stone in her chest, but cannot show it to anyone, defending a strategy she could not explain to people who had already decided she was wrong and who interpreted her silence as confirmation of their verdict. She attended board meetings where Barrett's allies asked pointed questions about the Paris engagement, sat through dinners with institutional investors who wanted assurances she could not provide, and endured the particular loneliness of a leader who knows she is right, but cannot prove it until the moment arrives. Lydia Carver, her executive assistant, was the only person who saw behind the carefully maintained facade, because Lydia was the one who brought coffee to the CEO's office at 2 in the morning and found Genevieve sitting in the dark with her phone on the desk, the screen occasionally lighting up with messages that were never from the one person she was waiting to hear from. Lydia understood that the coldness the world saw in Genevieve Whitmore-Kingsley was not a personality trait but a survival mechanism, the armor of a woman who had inherited a corporate empire built by men and who knew that any display of vulnerability would be interpreted not as humanity but as weakness. In Paris, the negotiation unfolded inside a private conference room on the top floor of a limestone building overlooking the Seine, where Madeleine Rousseau sat across from Everett with the patient severity of a woman who had spent 30 years evaluating risk and had learned to trust numbers over narratives. She told Everett within the first 10 minutes that Kingsley Whitmore Global represented an unacceptable level of exposure for her fund. The cross-border debt obligations were tangled beyond easy resolution. The financial disclosures contained gaps that suggested either incompetence or deception, and the internal dynamics of the company indicated that any capital infusion would be consumed by factional warfare rather than deployed toward recovery. She asked Everett to give her one reason to continue the conversation, and the way she asked made it clear she expected him to do what every other corporate emissary had done before him, which was to produce a polished presentation full of optimistic projections and strategic euphemisms designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Everett did the opposite of what Madeleine expected, and in doing so, he did the only thing that could have saved the negotiation. He set his worn briefcase on the polished table, unclasped the buckles with the deliberate calm of a surgeon preparing instruments, and laid out the complete financial picture of Kingsley Whitmore Global with a thoroughness that bordered on confession. Every failure was catalogued, every hidden liability exposed, every questionable decision the board had made presented without varnish or apology. He told Madeleine that she was correct about every risk she had identified, and that in fact the situation was worse than her analysts had estimated. He confirmed that the executive team was fractured, that certain members of the finance division had structured deals that benefited themselves at the company's expense, and that Barrett Ashford III had shown patterns of behavior consistent with someone actively undermining the CEO's authority in order to position himself for a takeover. Madeleine studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then asked why a man like Everett would risk his professional reputation by exposing the internal rot of the very company he was supposed to be saving. Everett told her that he was not there to save a wealthy dynasty or protect the egos of men who measured their worth by the size of their family trusts. He was there because thousands of employees across 3 continents would lose their jobs, their health coverage, and their stability if the company was sold to competitors who would strip it for parts, and those people deserved someone willing to tell the truth, even when the truth was ugly. Madeleine did not respond immediately, but the quality of her silence changed. shifting from skepticism to something closer to respect, and Everett understood that the negotiation had not ended but had finally, genuinely begun. Back in New York, Barrett saw Everett's continued absence as an open door and walked through it with the confidence of a man who believed his birthright entitled him to everything within reach. He organized a departmental meeting while Genevieve was occupied with investor calls and stood before 24 senior staff members to deliver what amounted to a political speech disguised as operational planning. He declared that the company could no longer afford to place its survival in the hands of an outsider, specifically referencing Everett as a suburban single father who had confused being handed an opportunity with actually deserving one, a man who imagined himself a hero because one sympathetic CEO had mistaken pity for potential. The words traveled through the building within the hour, reaching every floor and every department, and by the end of the day, the prevailing narrative among most employees was that Everett Hale had been given a chance far above his station and had predictably failed. Barrett followed the speech with a formal memorandum to the board recommending that Everett's advisory privileges be permanently revoked and that all restructuring files be transferred to his own team, a move that would effectively give Barrett control over the company's financial future and reduce Genevieve to a figurehead. He had the document printed on heavyweight letterhead, circulated it through channels designed to reach Sterling Beaumont's desk before Genevieve even knew it existed, and attached a timeline suggesting that if the board acted within 48 hours, the transition of authority could be completed before the restructuring deadline, positioning Barrett as the company's de facto strategic leader. When Genevieve discovered the memorandum, she did not respond with the fury that Barrett expected. Instead, she looked at Lydia and said only 5 words, "Wait until Everett comes back." Barrett, when informed of her response, smiled the particular smile of a man who believes he has already won, and said that Everett would not dare show his face again after such a spectacular failure. The final night in Paris arrived with the weight of everything that had led to it, and Everett sat across from Madeleine Rousseau for what both of them understood would be the last meeting before a decision was made. The negotiation had progressed through 2 weeks of intensive review, during which Everett had answered every question with the same unflinching honesty that had characterized their first encounter, and Madeleine had gradually moved from skepticism to cautious engagement to something approaching genuine partnership. The terms were nearly finalized when Madeleine's legal team received an anonymous package of documents alleging that Everett had fabricated portions of the financial data he had presented, that his credentials were manufactured, and that his presence in Paris was part of an elaborate scheme to defraud Rousseau Atlantique Capital. The accusation arrived at precisely the moment designed to cause maximum damage, late enough that trust had been built and early enough that it could still be destroyed. Everett did not panic, did not raise his voice, and did not waste time with emotional denials. He asked Madeleine's technology team to trace the digital origin of the documents, cross-referencing the metadata with the server access logs that Genevieve had authorized him to carry. Within 3 hours, the analysis confirmed that the fabricated documents had been uploaded from an account linked to the financial division of Kingsley Whitmore Global, an account whose access permissions traced directly back to Barrett Ashford III's team. Madeleine looked at Everett with an expression that had shifted beyond respect into something closer to admiration, because she now understood that this man was not merely fighting to save a company, but was doing so while being actively sabotaged by people within that same company who should have been his allies. Everett presented his final proposal with the calm precision that had defined every interaction Madeleine had witnessed. Rousseau Atlantique Capital would provide the $2.6 billion refinancing package, contingent on the immediate replacement of the compromised financial leadership, the appointment of an independent auditing committee, and the retention of Genevieve Whitmore-Kingsley as CEO under a transparent governance framework that would prevent any single individual from wielding unchecked authority again. Madeline reviewed the terms with the meticulous attention of a woman who had built her reputation on never committing capital to a venture she did not fully understand, consulted briefly with her senior partners in an adjacent office, and returned to the table where Everett sat waiting with the patience of a man who understood that pressure was the enemy of trust. She picked up her pen and signed, and the sound of that signature on paper was quieter than a whisper, but louder than anything Barrett Ashford had ever said. Everett stood by the window of the conference room at midnight, looking out over the city of lights spread beneath him, feeling the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from carrying the weight of other people's futures on your shoulders for weeks without rest. He did not call Genevieve to deliver the news electronically, because he knew that a signed document transmitted through digital channels could be intercepted, altered, or undermined by Barrett's network before it reached her hands. He would carry the original back to New York himself, because some things were too important to trust to anything other than personal delivery. Monday morning arrived in Manhattan with the gray light of early autumn filtering through the glass walls of Kingsley Whitmore Global's executive conference room, where the board of directors had assembled for what Sterling Beaumont had formally designated a leadership review session, but what everyone present understood to be the trial of Genevieve Whitmore-Kingsley. Barrett sat at the far end of the table with the relaxed posture of a man attending his own coronation, his restructuring proposal printed and bound in leather folders placed before each board member, his consulting contacts on standby awaiting the call that would officially begin the dismantling of the company under new management. Sterling opened the proceedings by asking Genevieve to present evidence that the French engagement had produced a viable outcome, and the silence that followed his question was the silence of a courtroom waiting for a verdict that everyone assumed had already been decided. Genevieve stood at the head of the table with her shoulders straight and her expression composed, but Lydia, watching from the doorway, could see the faint tremor in her hands and the shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of concealer could fully hide. She had still not received official confirmation from Everett that the agreement had been signed, and every hour of silence had added another layer of doubt to the fortress of conviction she had built around her decision to trust him. Sterling announced that if no verifiable result was presented within 60 minutes, the board would proceed to a formal vote on her removal, and Barrett's smile widened by exactly the fraction that he calculated would convey confidence without appearing premature. 47 floors below, in the marble and glass cathedral of the main lobby, the revolving door turned, and Everett Hale stepped through it carrying the same worn suitcase he had taken to Paris, wearing a dark coat that showed the wrinkles of an overnight transatlantic flight, and holding a sealed document folder that contained the signed agreement worth $2.6 billion. He did not announce himself, did not call ahead, and did not stop at the reception desk to sign the visitor log that temporary guests were required to complete. His shoes left faint marks on the freshly polished marble, and the sound of his suitcase wheels rolling across the lobby floor was the only noise in a space that had been filled with conversation just seconds earlier. The lobby staff recognized him immediately, and every conversation that had been flowing normally a moment before ceased as though someone had pressed a mute button on the entire ground floor, leaving only the distant mechanical hum of the building's ventilation system and the muffled pulse of a city that continued its business on the other side of the glass. The security guard, who had once joked about Everett's outdated briefcase, straightened in his chair. A junior analyst who had laughed at Barrett's joke about sightseeing along the scene suddenly found the pattern of the marble floor intensely interesting. Lydia saw him first through the glass partition separating the lobby from the executive elevator bank, and her voice carried up through the phone line to the 61st floor with the clarity of someone delivering news they had been waiting a month to speak. She said 4 words, "Mr. Hale is back." Genevieve heard those words in the middle of the conference room while Sterling was reviewing the procedural requirements for the removal vote, and Barrett was straightening his tie with the particular satisfaction of a man about to assume power he believed he had earned. Something shifted in her expression that Lydia would later describe as the moment the ice broke, not dramatically like a glacier calving into the sea, but quietly, like a frozen lake releasing its grip on the shore when spring finally arrives. She stood from her chair without excusing herself, turned away from the board, walked past Barrett without acknowledging his existence, and moved through the executive hallway toward the elevator with a pace that accelerated with every step until the controlled walk of a CEO became something closer to the urgent stride of a woman who had spent 30 days carrying a weight she could finally set down. She did not wait for the private elevator reserved for senior leadership. She took the first available car, descended 47 floors in a silence broken only by the digital chime of passing levels, and when the doors opened onto the main lobby, she stepped out into the sight line of every employee, visitor, and security officer present. Everett was standing near the center of the lobby, still holding his suitcase in one hand and the sealed document folder in the other, looking exactly like what Barrett had always called him, an ordinary man in an ordinary coat who had no business being in a building full of extraordinary wealth. But Genevieve did not see what Barrett saw. She saw the man who had walked into an impossible situation, told the truth when lying would have been easier, survived sabotage from his own colleagues, and carried the salvation of her company across an ocean because he had promised her he would. She crossed the remaining distance between them at a pace that abandoned every protocol she had ever observed as the head of a family empire, and when she reached him, she wrapped her arms around him in an embrace that was not romantic or performative, but was instead the raw, unguarded expression of a woman who had spent 30 days pretending she was not terrified and could finally stop pretending. The lobby watched in absolute stillness. Executives who had come downstairs for coffee stood frozen with cups halfway to their lips. The receptionist's fingers hovered motionless above her keyboard. Even the ambient noise of the building seemed to pause, as though the heating system and the elevator mechanisms and the distant hum of the trading floor had all conspired to give this moment the silence it deserved. Barrett emerged from the executive elevator 17 seconds later, having followed Genevieve down with the intention of publicly questioning her abandonment of the board meeting, and the scene he encountered stopped him as effectively as a physical barrier. He opened his mouth to deliver the dismissive remark he had been composing during the elevator ride, but before any words could form, Everett gently released Genevieve, placed the sealed document folder in her hands, and spoke in the same quiet, steady voice that had once silenced an entire boardroom by identifying 3 financial vulnerabilities in under 2 minutes. He said that Paris had signed, and that he knew exactly who had tried to destroy the deal. Genevieve stepped back from Everett, held the folder against her chest, and turned to look at Barrett with an expression that contained no anger, no triumph, and no vindication, only the calm certainty of a woman who now held every card in a game her opponent had believed was already over. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted from emotional release to something harder and more dangerous, and Barrett, for the first time in his carefully managed career, felt the ground beneath his assumptions begin to crack. The boardroom on the 61st floor had never been quieter than it was in the minutes following Everett's entrance, When he stood at the head of the table, where Genevieve had stood alone an hour earlier, and presented the fully executed agreement with Rousseau Atlantique Capital, the $2.6 billion refinancing package was confirmed in language so precise and binding that even the board's legal counsel, a woman famous for finding contractual escape hatches in documents written by sovereign nations, acknowledged that the terms were airtight. The company would retain control of its hotel chain across 11 countries, maintain ownership of its shipping port operations in the Atlantic corridor, preserve the fintech division that employed 3,000 engineers, and avoid the forced asset sales that would have enriched competitors at the expense of employees who had given years of their careers to Kingsley Whitmore Global. Barrett attempted to reframe the narrative immediately, claiming that the successful outcome was the product of the collective effort of the entire financial team and that Everett's role had been merely executional rather than strategic. But his voice carried the hollow quality of a man reading lines from a script that no longer matched the scene being performed. Everett opened the appendix section of the agreement without raising his voice or changing his tone, because the facts required no dramatic delivery. The forensic analysis conducted by Rousseau Atlantique Capital's technology team had identified the source of the anonymous documents designed to sabotage the negotiation, and the digital fingerprints led to a server account administered by a member of Barrett's financial division, using credentials that traced through 2 proxy layers before arriving at authorization codes assigned to Barrett's personal portfolio of access permissions. Sterling Beaumont demanded an explanation, and for the first time in anyone's memory, Barrett Ashford III did not have a prepared response. He stammered about delegation, about subordinates acting without authorization, about the impossibility of monitoring every action taken by every analyst in a division of that size. But his deflections collided with the letter Madeleine Rousseau had included in the agreement package, a formal statement from the fund declaring that Rousseau Atlantique Capital had agreed to the refinancing exclusively because of Everett Hale's unprecedented transparency, and that the fund's primary condition for proceeding was the removal of every individual involved in the attempted sabotage. Genevieve, standing now with the authority of a CEO whose position had just been saved by the very man the board had dismissed, announced Barrett's immediate suspension, authorized an independent investigation into his division's activities, and ordered the revocation of all financial system access associated with his team, effective before he left the building. The moment landed with the force of a door, slamming shut on everything Barrett had built, and the board members who had quietly supported his campaign against Everett now studied their agendas with the intense focus of people hoping to become invisible. Everett looked at Barrett across the conference table and spoke the words that would echo through the corridors of Kingsley Whitmore Global for years afterward. He told Barrett that he had not lost because Everett was smarter or more powerful or better connected. He had lost because he made the fundamental mistake of believing that decent people were easy to disregard, that kindness was a vulnerability to be exploited rather than a strength to be respected. Barrett said nothing in response, because for the first time in a career built on having the last word, he understood that no combination of syllables could undo what his own ambition had constructed and his own arrogance had destroyed. Later that afternoon, Genevieve assembled the full staff of the New York headquarters in the main atrium, a space normally reserved for investor presentations and holiday receptions, and delivered an address that departed so completely from her usual corporate communication style that several longtime employees later said it was the first time they had heard her speak as a human being rather than as a title. She announced the successful completion of the refinancing agreement and the preservation of every division and every position within the company. But, She did not stop at the financial summary. She spoke directly about Everett Hale, using his name with a deliberateness that made clear she intended every word to serve as a correction of the narrative that had been constructed in his absence. She said that for the past month, many people standing in this very room had mocked him behind closed doors, questioned his competence in conversations they assumed would never reach her ears, and weaponized his status as a single father to diminish everything he had accomplished, and that the man they had treated as unworthy of his position had done what the entire board of directors, with all their wealth and connections and generational privilege, had been unable to do. Everett stood beside her during the address, visibly uncomfortable with the attention but unwilling to retreat from it, because he understood that Genevieve was not simply thanking him but was publicly dismantling the culture of judgment that had allowed Barrett's cruelty to flourish unchallenged. Several employees in the audience lowered their eyes, recognizing their own participation in the whispers and jokes that had followed Everett's name through the hallways for weeks. Lydia watched from the back of the atrium with a quiet smile, satisfied that the truth had finally been given the same volume as the lies. Genevieve concluded the address by announcing the formation of an internal culture committee tasked with eliminating the practice of evaluating employees based on family background, personal appearance, or circumstances outside their professional performance, a declaration that carried additional weight because everyone present understood it was not a corporate platitude but a direct response to what had been done to a specific man who had earned something far better than contempt. The building emptied slowly that evening as the ordinary rhythms of corporate life resumed their flow, altered now by the seismic shift that had occurred in the span of a single morning. Everett packed his briefcase in his office on the 42nd floor, the same briefcase with the mismatched stitching that Barrett had once mocked as evidence of inadequacy, and made his way down to the lobby where the day had begun with an embrace that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. Genevieve was waiting for him near the glass wall that separated the lobby from the street, standing in the fading light of a city that never truly went dark, and when she saw him approach, her expression softened in a way that only Lydia and now Everett himself had ever been permitted to see. She told him that she had spent the past month maintaining the appearance of strength while privately terrified that she had sent him into an impossible mission from which no successful return was possible, and that every morning she had rehearsed the speech she would give if the board voted her out, and every morning she had deleted it because admitting the possibility of failure felt like betraying the trust she had placed in him. Everett set his briefcase on the marble floor and told her that he had not returned for recognition or applause. He had come back because he had made a promise that he would not let her lose her company to people who valued ambition over integrity, and because breaking promises was something he had decided long ago he would never do, not to his daughter, and not to the woman who had been brave enough to believe in someone the rest of the world had written off. They stood together in the quiet lobby as the last employees filed past. Two people who had arrived at this moment through entirely different paths, one born into wealth and power, and the other built by sacrifice and principle, yet standing now on level ground in a way that neither lineage nor title could have manufactured. The city lights beyond the glass wall painted long reflections across the marble floor, and the silence between them was not the awkward absence of words, but the comfortable presence of understanding. The kind of silence that only exists between people who have trusted each other with something irreplaceable and survived the test. Genevieve was no longer the untouchable CEO separated from the world by layers of protocol and expectation, the woman whose surname opened doors but whose solitude filled every room she entered. And Everett was no longer the overlooked outsider whose worth was measured by the age of his coat rather than the depth of his character. The man whose quiet competence had been mistaken for meekness by people who confused volume with value. Everett's phone buzzed with a message from home, and he glanced at it and said he needed to leave because he had promised to be back for dinner. Genevieve heard the words and smiled, understanding in that moment that the greatest power Everett possessed had nothing to do with the $2.6 billion agreement folded inside his briefcase, but everything to do with the fact that after saving an empire, his first thought was still to keep a small promise to the person who mattered most. 1 month ago, they said he did not deserve to stand beside the CEO of Kingsley Whitmore Global. But on the day he returned from France, the CEO herself ran through the entire building to prove that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the only one worth waiting for.